So this is Chivalry in the Age of Thrones. I'm Jim, commonly called something like a lawyer. I write for Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire.
Oh, I am Joanna Robinson. I host a couple podcasts, including Star Wars Spoilers and A Cast of Kings, and I write about Game of Thrones on the internet.
My name is Pat Spinagle, and I just started last year writing feature articles for Watchers on the Wall.
And my name is Val, and I run the YouTube channel Because Geek, where I make predictions about the show. And before every season starts, I look into the filming news and speculate based on those. And then I'm also doing animated videos based on the books, like recaps and stuff.
And when Sue Miller recruited us for the panel, it's somewhat under differing type of circumstances, because chivalry is like a broad term where it might be like a code of behavior, but usually it's associated with like knights and horsemanship and so on. So we might talk like crazy history about like, oh, let's talk about like the gear that knights have on. We're not going to talk too much about that, but we might want to talk about things like like courtly love, which is quite tied into like the chivalric ideal, and I might want to throw out some comparative lit type stuff talking about like Arthurian things, because when we talk about like what we understand of our chivalry, quite often we would talk about like white knights and Lancelot and the ideals of King Arthur, and there's influences of King Arthur in A Song of Ice and Fire, and so we might bounce around a lot. So I hope everyone is okay with that, because it's a Sunday and it's noon and whatever. What are you gonna do? Fire us? So that's where we're starting from.
I'm gonna give us 1-star reviews on the app.
Oh no! No. Only one person reviewed me so far, and it's perfect, and I don't want anybody else to.
Don't mess with Pat's perfect store.
So chivalry was a concept that was developed in the late Middle Ages, or late of the High Middle Ages, and it was considered to be a code of conduct. The actual word chivalry comes from the French word chevalier, which was a mounted warrior. And that was, a lot of times what they were doing was trying to harken back to a specific code of conduct, especially in regards to how knights and warriors should conduct themselves. They reached back to heroic ideals of the Crusades. If you actually study the Crusades, it was less than, I'll say that just to avoid the controversy, it was less than what they were preaching about chivalry. But that is the way of a lot of things, a lot of heroic ideals. They reach back to an earlier era of some sort of concept they're trying to bring forth, especially into the modern era, and trying to stress that conduct through social constructs such as chivalry.
Yeah, if I could throw a question to the panel, Jim brought up this concept of a code of conduct for knights, and where in like the books or the show do we see some kind of analogs with that?
So we do actually see in the Knightly Oath, we actually see that. The Knightly Oath where they say, in the name of the Father I charge you to be just, in the name of the warrior I charge you to be brave, in the name of the maiden I charge you to protect all women. So that is actually a sort of heroic set of ideals that you are supposed to live up to by taking on the oath and the status of a knight. You are supposed to uphold these conducts. As in reality in the books, that is not always practiced very well or at all in some cases.
So who's your favorite knight? Who's your favorite not knight? Well, I mean that is maybe like there's like a true knight and someone who is a knight who is perhaps a heinous example of being a knight.
So there's two types of not knights that I like.
Hold on, Jim. Hold on. Okay. I want the ladies to talk.
Oh, okay. Oh, by all means. By all means.
Val?
Well, so Jorah, and to clarify, like Jorah in the show is my favorite character. In the book, he's very different, but I would put Jorah as my favorite knight.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And your not knight?
My not knight's Davos.
Davos? Okay, good choice.
Val might be here under the same circumstances I am, which is that Sue was like, hey, do I want to go talk about Sir Jorah somewhere?
Yeah.
And I was like, I do. And then she's like, great, you're on a chivalry panel. I was like, okay. So yeah, Sir Jorah is definitely my answer as well. And then I kind of want to talk about the Hound, who's emphatically not a knight, and what his code of conduct is and how he exhibits some knightly behavior that far outstrips, Sir Meryn Trant or some other, people we might think of.
So my favorite knight is Daemon Blackfire, and my favorite not knight is Brienne of Tarth.
Yeah.
Good choice.
Brienne, I'm sorry.
It's a good choice.
Yeah, Brienne in particular, really lives this knightly heroic ideal, And in the books, you see her have to like make hard choices where she doesn't have to get involved and she would survive, or she can get involved because she's supposed to protect the weak, and so she makes these choices to protect the weak, and it's always like a really rough scenario.
No
for
choice,
her.
no chance.
Yeah, and that's the famous quote for that. Now I'm going to talk about Ser Jorah briefly, and I'll let everybody else chime in with Ser Jorah, because I like Ser Jorah because he's a good example to kind of follow through his progression of like the situation of knighthood in Westeros, because Jim talked about how a code of ethics or conduct was set up in the real world, based on perhaps excesses by knights, and some of those from the Crusades, and there's a disconnect between what they thought a knight should be and what a knight should be. And in Westeros, we have a sharp divide between the north, where they're just decent people, and the south, where they're less decent people, but they have knighthood, because there's this religious type of situation with the Faith of the Seven, that they have the anointed knights. But not everyone who is a knight is necessarily a follower of the Faith of the Seven.
Correct.
And Jorah is one of those guys. And I'll ask the panel, how did Jorah become a knight?
Battlefield promotion.
Yeah. And so Jorah was super brave, and was busted through the wall at Pike, and King Robert liked that, and he probably just said, "Like the cut of your jib, Joe," and Jorah said, "This is Jorah actually," and Robert said, "All right, Sir Joe," and that's how that happened.
Wait, can I just say really quickly that it's so fun to see Pat do one of his like fake conversations in real life. Because if you follow Pat on Twitter, or I've ever had an email from him, he does these like fan-fakey like conversations, and I've never seen you do them like real time. So thank you for that.
Pat is exactly the same person's Twitter that he is in real life.
And then he inserts himself into the fake conversation with the characters.
Thank you. Lisa, Pat's wife, has some more information from the audience.
I got my hype man in the audience, so. But Jorah in particular has this kind of connection with like kind of like the fanciful romantic notions of knighthood. Because of the kingdoms of Westeros, like the Reach is like one of the most more like fanciful romantic when it comes to chivalry, because they're big into knights in the Reach, and there's all these tournaments. And I think most of what happens in the Dunk and Egg books, and we can sort of talk about Dunk as a knight, takes place in the Reach, because they like tournaments, where they don't really do tournaments in the North so much, because they're more practical. And Ned has like a conversation about that with Jamie, that like, no, I don't joust. That's stupid.
Brandon did though.
Yeah, because Brandon, he was like into it. He was like into this whole kind of like a heroic ideal type of deal. So Jorah wins a tournament, and he gets a lady love from that, and she's like all into him because he's this big heroic knight, because she's used to the idea of knights being in the Vale. So he takes her back to Bear Island, and it is the suck compared to the Reach, and then he tries to put in all these like very fanciful things in Bear Island, which is the expensive, which leads to like bad things. I'm sorry.
The debt. It leads to the debt.
Listen, we're not saying Jorah is perfect. No. Val, do you have any further Jorah thoughts?
Well, he tries his best, and he tries really hard. I mean, no, but seriously speaking, I would say that from the different aspects of chivalry, Jorah is more focused on the romantic aspect, I would say, is one of his strengths, yeah. So whenever he's fallen in love, he will do anything for his lady.
And that's definitely one of the things. Is that okay for me to talk about this?
No,
now?
I want you to
All right.
roll with that.
That's one of the things I want to talk about on this panel, which is the idea of courtly love, chivalric love, which I think gets left out of some readings of A Song of Ice and Fire or the show itself. Because I'm a huge Jorah advocate, and it's okay if someone isn't, show Jorah, not book Jorah, then people are like, well, it's creepy, his thing with Daenerys, or do you really want him to be with Daenerys? And I was like, that's not the point as far as I'm concerned. Like, chivalric and courtly love is often divorced from like actual sex or actual attainment of the, the lady love. It's just sort of a devotion to and wanting to be completely there for, and we were talking about some other examples of that. What did I say to you outside the hallway, Pat?
You talked about the Hound, and you should talk more about the Hound.
Oh yeah, I want to talk about the Hound. Okay, so obviously the Hound's on a knight, but like that's how I feel about this whole Hound and Sansa thing. I get really creeped out when people ship it, and that's okay if you do, but you're a creep. No, you're not. But that is once again more, I think, more chivalric or courtly love. Like that's him wanting to protect a lady in a way. I mean, which sounds somewhat regressive for some people, you know, from a modern point of view. But like the idea of this champion, and Brienne is. I feel so dumb to not have brought her up, but obviously she's the best example of like a chivalric character in the book, and I love that George makes these non-anointed knights the more chivalric, that's so George to do, but Brienne's dedication to her various charges is not quite the same as chivalric love, but it's still just like this devotion, which is just not necessarily like I want them to bone. It's not about that, and so I just want to clarify.
That's a big theme of George R. R. Martin too. Is that the person who does not have the status ends up being the truest exemplar, and we have Brienne, who is one of the truest exemplars of being a knight, as well as Dunk, who says, "Are there no true knights among you?" When the joke is that yes, Dunk, you're not a knight, and no one is being fooled by that. And in Davos's case, Davos is not a noble. He was a commoner, but he's the most noble of all of Stannis' counselors. So that's actually a big theme of George's book,
right.
and the courtly, the chivalric part is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, I've been seeing some hands kind of like peek up. So we've been talking for a good 10. So maybe we should let the audience talk to us, and then we'll get back to talking and being in charge and so on in just a moment. But right now, you first. Yes.
So how would you compare like chivalric love, like the sort of one-sided devotion of like a knight to his lady or whatever, with like platonic love, kind of like the idealistic sort of
right.
super friendship of ancient Greek times or whatever?
Do you have like a platonic love example from A Song of Ice and Fire that you can think of?
I mean, maybe Arya and the Hound, kind of. I don't know. Like,
yeah.
As friends.
Yeah, I think because of Arya's like more childlike stature, because even though Sansa is a child, she's such like a princess of a child. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think Arya's more childlike stature puts that in a slightly different category as far as I'm concerned. Father-daughter sort of thing.
Okay.
John and Sam.
Yeah, John and Sam is a good example.
Yeah.
There's there are tremendous bonds of affection between those two.
Also, in chivalric love, there's actually the attainment of the actual love and a consummation is actually considered a sin and is negative. Lancelot and Guinevere being the key example in literature. You don't actually want to have that consummation. It's actually sort of a purging of the lust that is considered a sin by the Catholic Church, which was so influential in chivalry. So it's actually channeling these negative emotions that are instinctual to a satisfying conclusion, where then they are then purged out through the quests and all of these other notions of chivalry. So chivalric love is a little creepy in that way, where it's a devotion where you purge your unnatural and unwanted feelings through acts of great sacrifice and horror to go and quest for the lady, to perform great deeds for the lady love. Because
bravery and daring
because you thinking that she's hot is a bad thing.
I want to talk more about that, but I have someone here from the audience, so all the way in the back.
I like the chivalric love, but with chivalry, how is it, you guys think about how it's tied into like noblesse oblige and like the class responsibility? Because a lot of what makes this so horrible is that when knights don't follow the chivalric code, they're like directly breaking the social contract.
Correct.
They get all these benefits because they are sworn
Yes.
Right.
to risk their lives.
The idea of a military caste turning on the people that they are supposed to defend is actually big throughout literature, and it's not just in Western Europe. You can actually see it in a lot of different places. But you are absolutely right. The idea of the knight being an elevated warrior type class, the implicit promise of that is that you will protect those who are non-combatants by fighting other warriors. Now, how it actually ended up turning into is usually a bunch of chevauchés. But you are absolutely right in these hierarchical social constructs. Knighthood definitely fed into that, and the idea of noblesse oblige, which is more of the actual noble caste as opposed to the knightly caste, which is a little bit different, but they are so intertwined they might as well. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. You are exactly right, sir.
Yeah, there was a great anointed knight, Sir Lancelot, and joined the faith militant and probably sacrificed himself to not blow out the candles near the well.
Everyone, R.I.P. Sir Lancel. No.
I was going to say, is the faith militant, do they represent closer knighthoods than some of these false knights are
the Faith Militant actually has, and one of their orders is actually only 4 knights. So.
Yeah, no, but I appreciate what you're saying, that the that the faith no, I am totally into this man's worldview. The faith militant certainly harkens back to what we would consider like a religious order of knights, and if we can allow that any knight can make a knight, then Joe Blow with a club and a tattoo on his head could be a knight. I'm not going to argue against that. But I like we should add the faith militant up along with our Night's Watch guys as Ursat's quasi knights, and and again, Lancel he was done wrong. Yeah. John.
So the Andals came from Essos. I forget, were they pushed out of Essos, or are there still knightly orders?
They were fleeing Valyrian aggression.
Yeah. Yeah, they learned iron making from the Rhoynar, and the Rhoynar went. I mean, they were taken out. So I think then the Andals migrated pretty much in mass, I guess, hitting the Vale.
Yep. The Vale first.
And the Vale has all these super knightly traditions as well, probably because of that.
Can we talk about Sir Loras?
We can talk about Sir Loras. Oh, the dreamy Sir Loras.
Knight of the Flowers. No, I'm just curious, what you think he represents to George in the book, like what he as a concept of knighthood represents to George in the books.
So I actually think he is contrasted not necessarily for his knighthood, but for his contrast to Jaime, because Jaime sees a lot of himself, the really, really young, hot-blooded knight. Because Loras is the one who Loras says, "Oh, I'm a great knight, I'm a great jouster," and stuff like that. His brother's also a great jouster, but he doesn't brag about himself nearly so much. Yes, Loras was a great knight, and in a red rage after Renly died, he killed 2 innocent people. So let's not forget, that Loras is in many ways an exemplar of a knight. He's an exceptionally good jouster. He's an exceptionally good fighter on horse and on foot. But he also exemplifies a lot of the negative traits of knights, this sort of unchecked aggression and the fact that he can hide behind his status to protect him.
Well, and the fact that he used a horse that was in heat to win.
Yep. The Trixie win.
Mm.
So not so much of an exemplar of a knight as far as you're concerned.
Well,
a true knight, maybe. He's not a true knight. He is a knight. He did the oath. He's a good warrior, but I don't think he's a true knight. Not the way Brienne, if she actually had an oath, was.
Right. Sir does not make you a knight, is
Nope.
what you're saying. Great.
No, the conduct does, and that's why I think one of actually Brienne's best scenes about chivalry is actually with Nimble Dick Crab after he's dead. It benefits her absolutely no way to dig that or to throw the coins into Nimble Dick Crab's grave and apologize, but she does it anyway because the actual ritual has meaning to her, and it really has meaning to us. I'd say that chapter right there is exactly the same. This is not a grimdark book. This is actually a romantic book. It's a realistic romantic book, but it is not a grimdark book. That gesture that she did actually meant something, even though Nimble Dick Crab is dead and she could actually use those coins. It's significant, it's meaningful, and I think that's one of the big draws of chivalry. It's the same thing with Sansa. Sansa appeals to Sandor with these stories of the knights, even though Sandor is no knight, and an anointed knight just grabbed him and just threw his face into a coal, and that's awful. Then he was anointed with oils by the crown prince himself, and that's it's like for Sandor, that's like, well, everything is pointless. But then Sansa shows him the meaning of the actual stories, and even if they don't always fulfill, the actual concepts behind them are meaningful.
And we know that, like, deep down inside, Sandor, when he was young, he was like into he was into the idea of being a knight. And what I like about him, you guys, I'll ask your question in a second. But the thing I like about Sandor is that in the Lannister-held territories, there are famous knights in the Reach, and there are famous knights in the Vale, but then there are some famous knights. Like Jaime is from the West, but there's not a lot of talk about like the chivalry of the Reach. So I like young Sandor who like being like really into it, and then having it all horribly taken away by an anointed knight.
The Knights of the West did actually make a show in the Blackfire Rebellion. So the Knights of the West do exist. I think they just don't, just like Loras, they don't brag about it as much.
All right, in the back. Oh, sure.
Yeah, you guys are talking about Brienne, Jim. You didn't know this. I'm just very interested because I think knighthood in the book isn't it kind of an object lesson that it is impossible to live by a code of ethics? If these, like, when you live by a dogmatic code of ethics, you will eventually run into situations where that code will fail. So Brienne has sworn an oath to Catelyn Stark, and now this oath fails because, you know, it's impossible to satisfy that oath to kill an enemy. So, like, with the church, with knighthood, these very simple, compact codes will never get you through life.
Well, that's true. I mean, you can never. I mean, how can any code reconcile to reality? Can any code of ideals reconcile to reality?
Joanna, what do you think of that?
No, I agree.
Okay.
No. There's plenty of time for all of this talk. I think the concept of oath breaker, oath keeper, which is just something that is mentioned a lot in the books and in the show. This idea that, you know, Jon, in order to save the realm, has to like break his vows. Like this. That is exactly, I think, the point of a lot of what's happening in the story. I think you've really hit on it, which is just sort of these structures may have worked for the few for a time, but especially with this chaotic intrusion, this chaotic evil intrusion from the north, these trappings of civilization can't hold up against what is coming and what has always actually been there, I think.
So speaking of the code of ethics, like when it fails and that idea, I have this idea going to run in my head. It's not super clear right now, so maybe you guys can help me out a little bit, clarify it. But I'm thinking like the overall result of knighthood and knighting people and having this code of ethics, even if people don't stick to them 100%, you can still have a really good result from them, which what I see from it is that you give that code of ethics to knights, and you basically elevate knights, put them on a pedestal, make them look like the most awesome people, so that other people look up to them. And then when other people look up to them, they want to follow that same code of ethics in their everyday lives, just so that they can feel like knights, you know. So I mean, I find like that would be a good result.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That's the like best thing you can hope for, is that the code of conduct that most of these knights don't always follow is something that other people will aspire to, and when it comes to making everyday moral decisions, you know, a young starstruck Bran or whatever could be like, well, what would the knight do? And I'll do that, you know.
Yeah, and you see that payoff with Dunk in those books, because he strove to be a knight, even seeing all this bad stuff going on. And the same with Brienne. Dunk and Brienne are like the axis on, you know, the moral spectrum of what goes on around Westeros. They're so good.
Well, and I think throughout history, you actually do see, in a variety of cultures, again, it's not just Western Europe, but all over, you actually see the idea of these warriors taking charge and then a code of ethics being put upon them. And I mean, you see this from Japan to the Mesoamerican tribes and South American tribes, even the North American tribes. You have in Africa, in Southeast Asia. You have all of these throughout history. You always find that there's going to be a military, a need for force, and a need to be able to control that force through the strictures of government. And a lot of ways they do that is through this social lens, this social idea of pressuring them to commit conduct in such a way. So I definitely say that it's 100%. You're 100% right. Yes, the ideals will fail, but the absence of them, I do believe, is a little bit worse.
You had a question in front?
When it comes to, I guess, acknowledgement of other, like, legit knights, when it comes to, like, Sir Courtney Penrose, when he's defending Storm's End, and
against the one true King Stannis.
When he's calling out like the other
Book Stannis.
knights, about how they swapped over, but he also defends Brienne, saying there's no way that that girl was in love with him. So there was kind of an acknowledgement of the honor in other people as well, and not lying, always telling the truth.
Right, and what's good is in the, I don't want to talk about Dunk and Egg all the time because not everyone has read them, but when Dunk does get his squad of knights, for the tourney, and some of them are doing it because they don't like the other guys that Dunk is fighting, but there are some people who are moved by Dunk's plight and I think he's good. And I know that he would like the armorer gave him like a super discount on fixing things because Dunk,
He was remembered his vows.
Yeah, he was standing up for for Tansy Too Tall, right? And
Tansy Too Tall, yeah. No, that was a good story. But also remember this for Courtney Penrose. Courtney Penrose says, "Oh, all of you who switched your flags."
Yeah.
But then he goes and sends out a message that says, "Anyone who will defend me, I'll swear allegiance to." So let's not forget that everyone is going to be using these things for their own self-serving interests. It only matters if you're a bastard when I don't need anything from the bastard, and so on and so forth. These things they're just like everything else. People are people, and they're gonna use whatever they can to get ahead.
All right, we have 10 minutes left, and so I'm just I do want to ramble briefly, like super briefly about Arthurian stuff, and maybe that'll get people excited.
I'll open up to questions.
All right, yeah, and at any point, feel free to ask questions. In high school, I think a lot of people might have read like T.H. White's Once and Future King, which is great because because Merlin is teaching Arthur really how to be a knight and then how to be a king, and there's parallels to that in the books. But we also had to read Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King. Have you read that? And it's like 12 long ass poems about King Arthur. And one thing that he did is that he talked a lot about King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot. And then we get into this whole deal you mentioned briefly about like the violation of the kind of the courtly love deal, where we get that Lancelot's in love with Guinevere. Of course, all the knights should be in love with Guinevere. Maybe not that much in love. And then, and Tennyson really had like an agenda where he wanted to make King Arthur look as best as possible in this scenario. And part of what he did is he also told the story of King Mark, Tristan, and Isolde. Yeah. And that's a different situation where King Mark was just a jackass, and Tristan and Isolde were kind of like fated to fall in love. And he did that to make Guinevere look super bad, and Lancelot to look super bad, and Arthur to look super good by having this contrasting thing. And so I was thinking, like, because you can find parallels to things if you try hard enough. And so this is a spurious thing, but I wanted to talk about anyway. That in the books you have this kind of like a quasi-Arthurian situation going on with King Robert and his wife, Cersei, and Jaime, and that's a bit more involved than just Lancelot and Guinevere. I'm like, but is there like another triple to make that, to put some kind of like a mirror on that as well? And there is.
What do you got?
I got Robert and Ned and Lyanna. Not that Ned and Lyanna, have a thing going on, but in both cases...
Pat, I thought you were just about to blow something wide open that we missed in the text.
What? No.
You heard it here first.
This is totally wasting time.
No.
But I really wanted to cast this type of deal of like, Robert and his trusted like dude, Ned, and Robert is in love with his lady, but it is Ned's love for Lyanna, but a proper love, to betray Robert by sheltering Jon Snow, and carrying that lie for so long, and Lancelot, he definitely had like shame and guilt over like being in love with Guinevere, but she was like so crazy hot, man, So Ned had all this kind of like, similar guilt for taking care of Jon. He had to do all this type of like lying for it, whereas Jaime does not have this at all. Now, I don't know if there's anything that this is even relevant whatsoever, but I wanted to bring that up. If anybody wants to talk about Arthurian parallels, I am here for that. Yeah.
George also plays with that concept with Aemon the Dragon Knight and Mary's and
Give me a quick summary of that for people who are unfamiliar with other parts of the books.
Yeah, so it's a Targaryen historical set of characters, and it's basically the king, Aegon, marries his sister, as the Targaryens do, but there's this very romantic tale, and people play it up as a full romantic love of whether Aemon the Dragon Knight is in love with his sister, Mary's, who was the one the king married. And he's a member of the Kingsguard, and one of the great historical members of the Kingsguard. And so there are aspersions cast that they are romantic love, and he's fathering bastards upon her, but
including Daemon II.
Yes, but he's also held up as the greatest knight in the realm, and he's known as a very good person, defending commoners and people's honor constantly. So it's incongruous with the rumors cast upon him.
Well, and to further add the Arthurian thing, the person that Aegon IV uses to cast the aspersions is named Morgil. Morgil Hastwick. So George was very, very clearly channeling Arthurian lore when he was writing Aemon the Dragon Knight.
Do you have a favorite Arthurian legend, Pat?
Me?
Yeah.
Anything to do with Gawain.
Uh-huh. Gawain.
Yeah, you know, and I consider, like, Jim and I had talked about like who's a knight in Westeros and who's not, and who has problems with vows. And Jim brought up Ned Stark, and immediately I was dismissive because I'm like a big butt. And I'm like, oh, Ned's not a knight, he's from the north, whatever. But no, I totally get that Ned represents this total quality of knighthood that we really admire. You know, even if he's from like this northern tradition that doesn't have that. And and so he's kind of like in an Arthurian archetype, he's like the pagan knight because in King Arthur's court there were pagan knights because England was not completely Christian in the myth stories, and so Ned kind of like hits that role, and so I kind of imagine Sean Bean playing Gawain in an Arthurian deal.
And you can actually even say that Ned follows those kind of clannish structures that mirrors the the Frankish and Germanic traditions that eventually would influence the code of chivalry and knighthood, concept of knighthood. So there's a little bit of he's just kind of floating an older and perhaps even purer form of knighthood.
Joanne, do you have a favorite Arthurian story, and how does it relate to the wonderful Guy Ritchie movie, King Arthur: Legend of the Sword? Because really,
Pat's bringing online fights to a panel where we've gone back and forth about the Guy Ritchie, Charlie Hunnam vehicle, King Arthur, which I think is an atrocity and he loves. No, the story that I think about all the time is I took a course in Arthurian legends in college, which just means if you want to fill a whole college course, you have to read the same story over and over and over again in different versions in like French and English and blah blah. And my favorite story is this story, and please correct me if I'm misremembering, I believe of Lancelot and Guinevere, where like they're sharing a room and they're trying to keep it cool. So they're like, we won't be in the same bed. We'll stay in these two separate beds. It's fine. And then there's flour on the floor, right? And like flour, and if the flour is disturbed by footsteps, they'll know that someone crossed the path and to get to the other bed. And so right, I think Lancelot tries to find a loophole by leaping over the flour to get to the bed. But I think he cut himself, so there are drops of blood in the flour, and that's how they're found out. And that's just like, I don't know, it's a banana story that I really like, that involves a barrier of flour, a loophole, and then I don't know, an untreated wound. So.
I don't know much about the Arthurian legends or anything like that, so I can't really add much there. But before we ended the panel, I just felt that we needed to bring up really quickly the fact that in real life, knights are very smelly, and they don't take showers and stuff, so it's like
breaking news.
You mean like the fact that very few people actually? I mean, actually there were medieval baths, but being in armor is very sweaty. I can tell you this personally, as having worn armor for a long period of time. It is very sweaty.
Is it better or worse than hockey pads? Because that's the worst smell I've ever smelled in my entire life.
Are you asking if like the gambeson itself is smellier than hockey pads?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be honest, I've never actually had them right next to each other and had to take a good look.
Okay, well next year we will have this answer for you.
that was probably the best statement I've heard to close down a panel. So thank you, Val. And thank you everyone for showing up for a panel.
Thank you, guys.
Yep.